Good morning, everybody in Glasgow. Good evening to people watching the live stream in Australia. And welcome to this launch of the B Team's Climate Leaders Coalition Roadmap to 2030. Now, I'm fortunate enough to be here in Glasgow, but I do know many of you will be watching in Australia. So I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners, whoever they are, where you are watching this live stream from. They acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging. So, as I say, I'm fortunate enough to be in Glasgow, and the three emotions I have after 2 or 3 days on the ground here, one is the urgency. I don't think that's lost on any of you. One is the optimism, not even cautious optimism, as the British Prime Minister said yesterday, but actually I'm optimistic. And the third is a big question that I think is on everybody's mind here. Certainly the urgency, well, that comes from the fact it's not lost on anybody here, and I don't think it's lost on anyone in society, that the fact that we are still, discharging emissions equivalent to, I think, 600,000 Hiroshima-scale bombs into the troposphere every day, and 93% of that heat energy is absorbed into the oceans. That's effectively what's happening. That's urgent, and the human cost as well as the environmental cost is not lost on anybody here. But my optimism comes amongst all the press reports and the people who aren't here, actually the optimism that, 90% of the world's emissions are now committed to some kind of net zero. And 2/3 of that is by 2050. And that's an increase from 1/3 that was committed to 2050 after Paris. That's pretty good progress in a small number of years. So I'm optimistic, particularly as once we get to that net zero, the lag time is pretty short, right? So we have to get there, but once we get there, the lag time, I think people have estimated that to be less than a decade, right? 3 to 5 years before we could start to see some positive change and stopping the escalation of temperatures. But the question that's on everybody's mind here is the how. It's not what the goal should be or the target should be. It's how to actually do it. And you know what? It's all of us that have to work out that how. And that how can't wait until 2049. We have to start taking the actions this decade in the how. So that's the question that the Climate Leaders Coalition set out to address in the roadmap to 2030. And the good news is, in Australia, the 33 businesses representing about a quarter of Australia's total emissions that make up the Climate Leaders Coalition have been working very hard on the how. And you will see in this roadmap many of the actions that are already being taken, the ones that are being planned, and the ones that will be implemented. So those businesses can make terrific progress through their goals and hopefully provide illustrations to others to learn from the parts that don't work and share the parts that do work. And that's the context today that we wanted to launch the report actually here in Glasgow. I would like to introduce some terrific guests both in the room and on video who are going to help us do that. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge Helle Thomasdottir, who is the global CEO of the B Team, that will be speaking to us shortly. Also Andrew Liveris and Keith Tuffley, who are from the global leadership of the B Team, which has been a wonderful organization to provide the sponsorship and impetus to bring these CEOs together. I would like to thank Sharon Thorne, who's the global chair of Deloitte, who are hosting us today, and also reflect on the appreciation we all have for John O'Brien and the Deloitte team. They just do a wonderful job supporting us and have from the very beginning. So we are going to hear first from Helle and then from Sharon, who have some brief remarks for us before I hand over to my co-chair of the Climate Leaders Coalition, David Thodey, who's joining us by video from Australia, who's going to introduce what he thinks of the report and its origins and why it's so important. We'll then hand over to a panel, which will include some of those who've spoken, but also two of our CEO members coming in from Australia, Stuart Irvine from Lion and Stephen Worrell from Microsoft. Finally, Andrew Liveris will offer some closing remarks. So thank you once again. The challenge is upon us. And that question, how? Well, let's see if we can make some progress in the next hour and provide some ideas and inspiration. Thanks again for watching. I'm going to introduce now Helle Thomasdottir, the global CEO of the B Team, to share her reflections on the Climate Leaders Coalition.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John, and good morning, everyone. I'm Helle, and I could not be more thrilled to be here virtually with you and with those of you in the room this morning on the launch of the roadmap to 2030. So just a quick background, the B Team was founded in 2013 to tackle business as usual. And at the time, I believe the main question people asked us is, why is business as usual no longer an option? Well, that's no longer happening. I think we all know we can't live together on a burning planet with a broken social contract. So B Team leaders were ahead of their games, but now I believe we all realize this. But we're asking how. John is absolutely right. And so we have since, I think the proudest moment, early days for B Team, was when the B Team leaders rallied. It's a group of global business leaders and leaders from civil society, and they rallied to get the Paris Agreement across the line in 2015. And this multi-stakeholder approach to get a global agreement on this existential crisis that faces all of us on our possibility to thrive, not just survive, but thrive on this planet, was something that wouldn't have happened without people coming together. Well, here we are, 5 years and 6 years into it, actually. We got COVID on top of it. We've also, I think, increasingly realized that we can't tackle climate without addressing inequality. We're at unsustainable levels, and we can't address any of it without addressing accountability. Business isn't going to earn its license to operate without addressing accountability. So I'd say our agenda today is more holistic, but we need the roadmaps. We need the hows. So B Team recently launched a new leadership playbook because ultimately this comes down to leadership. We can no longer think about leadership as being something about delivering financial profit for the short term, because frankly, we can't even deliver it in the long term unless we address these existential crises we are facing. So we can't even do right by shareholders unless we start considering and bringing all stakeholders together. So I'm thrilled that Australia's business leaders have come together in this coalition, and I want to congratulate you, and I want to thank you for being the brave leaders we now need in Australia. And it is a fact that private sector leadership, when it raises its ambition, it influences government's ambition. And civil society in Australia, we know this, has been asking for greater leadership on climate for a long time. So this is important. And it's not just important that we rally behind the original goal of the B Team to get to net zero by 2050. We have to get to 2030 and ideally half our emissions by 2030. And we need to make sure it's a just and equitable transition, because otherwise we leave too many people behind and we actually end up facing political headwinds. So it's critical that we think about climate with an equity lens, with a just lens. And it's critical that we hold ourselves accountable. So I congratulate you on the roadmap. It is a great how-to. Other people will speak to that. But I also urge you to make sure that it's an equitable journey, to make sure that you actually hold yourself transparently accountable for disclosing progress on the way. It's a journey. None of us have all the answers, but if we come together, we can discover them and we can make great progress. And that is what our children and grandchildren need from us right now. This is the moment. So I want to also thank Lynette for spearheading our efforts in Australia. And I want to particularly speak to you CEOs. I know this is not an easy journey. I know you've been vulnerable, you're sharing your challenges, so does the B Team regularly. None of us have all the answers, but one thing is for sure, when we come together and we create a community of courage and accountability, we can actually go from this moment that none of us like to this future that all of us as human beings know we need to get to. And now you have the roadmap to 2030. So thanks for showing the way and congratulations. We're here to support now and always, and are deeply grateful for the brave leadership you're showing. Thank you.
Thank you, Helle, and particularly the human challenge, right? How we can have an inclusive and just transition that doesn't leave anyone behind. I know that's something on our CEOs and our coalition's minds all the time. So thank you for that reminder. Now, it's with gratitude I'd like to introduce Sharon Thorne. who's the Global Chair of Deloitte.
Thank you, John, and thank you for your inspiring opening, but also Hala for yours. That's given me a real spring in my step to go out for the rest of the day. And just like to add a very warm welcome to everybody in the room here in Glasgow, but also to everyone online. And I know it's very late for you, so thank you for tuning in for what is going to be a great discussion. And also just wanted to recognise Lynette Main and also Sharon Burrows, who I had a number of conversations with early on when you were setting up for CLC, and just again how inspiring you both are to the rest of us. Now, the Climate Leaders Coalition was also the inspiration for a project that I am leading with John O'Brien, which is focused on chairs globally. And we're working with the World Economic Forum to focus on increasing sort of the role that chairs and boards play, helping educate them, helping get them more engaged in the whole agenda and driving forward what businesses are doing. And as I say, the CLC played a key role in inspiring us to get this going. So huge thanks to you for that. And our Australian CEO, Adam Powick, we were hoping he was going to be here. He sends his apologies, and he's unfortunately not able to join this call, but he and his team have been incredibly supportive of the CLC since you were established, and I understand has been leading the work of developing this roadmap with you. Now, the need to operate in different ways, for us to solve global challenges, and obviously climate is the biggest one facing us at the moment. As we've said, it is an existential threat. And it's not, it's to the planet, it's to humanity, and we have to address it, we have to take action. And it's radical collaboration that's needed between governments, with businesses and civil society. And I am optimistic as well that if we really focus on it, we can tackle it. But we need to see collaboration across sectors, across value chains, across regions and globally, to really find the solutions to these complex problems, but also to share them. And I think that's a fantastic role that the CLC is playing. And I do hope that you will be an inspiration to lots of other countries and businesses of the sorts of things that can be done. And I also think it's great to see companies coming together in Australia to work collaboratively on these projects in your roadmap. And as I say, providing that roadmap for others. Now, Australia doesn't always get the best press on this issue, and so this level of collaboration and action is outstanding, and I think will transform many people's views as to what is happening in Australia, which is fantastic. Now, Deloitte globally, we're supporting projects like the CLC, but we're also the World Economic Forum Chairs Governance initiative that I referenced, but also we're helping lots of our clients transition. We're working on decarbonising sectors with Princeton University, on decarbonising whole regions with Cambridge University, and we've also done some really excellent economic damage studies through our team in Australia with Pradeep Philip. So again, if you haven't seen those, they are extremely compelling narratives and facts about how we can that the climate transition actually would be very, very positive financially for particularly the regions in Asia Pacific. So on behalf of Deloitte in Australia, in Glasgow and globally, just want to thank all the CLC members for being so proactive and engaged with the vision of creating and thriving and decarbonising the country by 2030. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Now at this point, I'd also like to ask all of you watching to be thinking of some questions for our CEOs and panelists and to put those in the Q&A. So as we now start to talk more about the roadmap, I would love your hardest questions for them. I know they're looking forward to them too. At this point, I'd like to turn over to my co-chair, David Thodey, to talk more about the roadmap. Now, I couldn't ask for a better co-chair to work with than David. I learned so much from him. He's by turns, inspiring, thoughtful, and demanding, often all in the same sentence. So David, if I maybe could ask you to share your personal reflections on what we're doing here and where it might go, what we might gain from it.
Thanks, John, and good morning to Glasgow. Good evening to everyone here in Australia. I'm on Gadigal land, just on the north side of Sydney Harbour, and I'd like to pay my respect to their elders past and present as we're on this part of the Eora Nation. And look, my thanks to Hala. It's really great to meet you, see you, and the B team has been such an inspiring leader, and Lynette's really been a part of that. And Sharon as well. We've been so grateful to have Deloitte's support through this process. And John O'Brien is he is a machine, I think would be the only way to say it. He's just been incredibly inspiring and hardworking. And of course, to my co-chair, John Lydon, who is the wonderful person who sort of holds us all together as we've been through this journey. Now, as John said, I've got a role just to spend a little bit of time talking about the Climate Leaders Coalition, just a little bit of context. And then I want to talk about the roadmap itself, the background to it, its purpose, and then just really refresh our memories just on what we covered in that. And I do want to just stress, this is CEOs of major Australian companies talking about what they're doing. And as I think we're all sort of talking around, and Hannah sort of really mentioned, this accountability, this leadership, this is what's required. Politicians will come and go, but we're the ones who end up doing the work. So just in terms of the Climate Leaders Coalition, it was an initiative that really Lynette and the B team kicked off in 2020. And it was all around sort of finding a responsible and equitable transition to this low emissions economy, because it was the right thing to do, but also it's an opportunity. There's an opportunity for Australia. But again, as Hannah said, this is not easy. And for anyone who's been a CEO, and Stuart and Steve will talk to it, actually getting to net zero, if you've got any legacy at all, is really, really hard. And it takes real leadership, it takes real capital, and it takes real resolve. And of course, so often I sit in meetings like this, and often the real tough things are not put on the table. So that's why this was so important. We wanted to bring together a broad church of CEOs in Australia from different industries so that they could share best practice and talk about what they were doing, what they're doing with their suppliers, what they were doing with their customers. So that's why it was so important. And we think that we need more of this. And it's not just between CEOs of large corporations, it's, getting government involved, not-for-profit involved, and of course the academic community. So the roadmap idea really started back around, early 21. And we thought, well, what can we do ahead of COP26 to put something practical on the table, something that reflected some of the initiatives, some of the companies that we were working with were really doing, and sort of laying out what challenges they had, because sometimes it's messy. Sometimes it's not as clear as you would like to do it when you've got to approve billions of dollars of capital to invest. Sometimes we can't quite see the immediate returns. So we wanted to have a forum where we could talk about it. I mean, Scope 3 was a classic example. If you're starting to really look at Scope 3, wow, it's more than challenging. It's confronting. And so that was the background. And it's been really just, I've found it inspiring listening to the CEOs of these companies about what they're doing as they drive decarbonisation. So when John said, the general sort of feeling in Glasgow was one of urgency but optimism, I'm encouraged because we need optimism to really weather the difficulties we got in front of us. So the roadmap purpose is really there to lay out some practical solutions in a practical way that companies can go on the journey. And look, we would love to do more by 2030. but we are encouraging and creating an environment where CEOs can really share and talk about what they're doing, being it, in carbon storage, whether they're trying to, get into hydrogen or renewable energy, what they're doing with their own power consumption, etc. So let me just sort of run through, or at least really probably remind most of you what the key findings were from this great, roadmap. And I do really, again, want to recognize John and the support of Deloitte through this. So firstly, the climate-related transition that's going to happen through the 20s, is significant, and we can't wait. It's all about action now, and we can't wait for others to do it, because if we sit back and wait, it's going to be caught in process and political, rhetoric. We want action, and we want to do it now. The second thing is really that it's got to be more than what often I see. And of course, I, as a chairman, I go and see investors and they go through and tell me what your ESG strategy is. At times, I've felt that from some companies, I don't say for all, it's been a bit tick the box, oh, yes, we're doing that. Here's our, carbon footprint. This is what we're doing. But it really needs to be a part of your business strategy. It needs to be in your DNA, and hopefully moving it from response to more opportunity going forward. And I think to give great credit to Twiggy, and I think in terms of what he's doing, he's taking the green hydrogen opportunity and saying, well, how can I be a supplier of green hydrogen to the world? And Australia has a unique position both in solar and in some of the work we've done in hydrogen. But of course, we're going to need to partner with many organizations around the world as we move forward. And that really sort of plays into our place, Australia. As Sharon and Hannah were very kind to us. But yeah, we have enormous resources. And I'm sure Andrew Liveris will talk about that, because he's been on the global stage for a long time. He's seen the opportunity. He says, yeah, look, we can do this. We've had this wonderful history in the resources sector, also in agrarian, still do, by the way. We're very strong in that area. Also, where I've been at CSIRO, we've been developing the seaweed that can reduce methane from cattle, which is an enormous breakthrough. And so we really need this innovation that's going to start to drive real, I think, better outcomes in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. But it's this question of leadership. You need to stand up and be counted. You need to say, yes, we're going to make this change happen. And I've been really impressed. I mean, look at what BHP's done. Look at what Rio's done. Rio just committed $10 billion by 2030 to move towards net zero. Now they've got a big challenge because they're big power consumers, but this is real action. This is boards and leaders taking real shareholder money and saying, we're going to do something and stand up. And I've been really impressed with a lot of what those companies are doing. Yeah, but we do need to be aware, and that's been part of the challenge we've had here in Australia, of the social change, this whole transition around inclusion and a just transition. Because for us in Australia, we've got big communities that have been, really founded on fossil fuel, and you can't just turn that off. This is real people's lives. So we've got to have a sense of compassion and humanity in that, and also a sense of urgency. So I really think that it's very important that we take time to invest to understand those challenges and try to work them through. And we as leaders of corporate Australia and corporations around the world, I think we can play a critical role. So I do think now is the time for change. Now is the time to take more action. And I look forward to discussing with it, because this is so important for all stakeholders that we have. So that's just a little bit of background on CLC, and also the roadmap to 2030, shifting to a low carbon future. So John, back to you.
Thank you, David. And yeah, really encourage everybody to get on the website, download the roadmap. There's so much richness in there. And I think you'll be surprised in a really positive way by how much is already happening, with more to do, of course. So I'd like to turn to two of our member CEOs and hear what this means for them and why the roadmap is so important and what they see as the positive contribution business is, can, and will make to that target. So first of all, Stuart Irvine. Now, Stuart, since he was studying the planet at university, has always had an interest in our environment and what we need to do to make that sustainable and equitable. And now as the chief executive of Lion, which is as you can see from some of the brands behind him, Australia's leading, best and tastiest beer and beverage company.
Thanks, John.
Stuart, what does this all mean for you?
Yes, thank you. Yes, well, it did all start just down the road from where you all are at Edinburgh University, back when dinosaurs roamed the earth. Welcome to everybody on the call. Happy Wednesday. I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I'd like to just take these few minutes to talk about three things: where we've been, what are the challenges that we see ahead, and how the Climate Leaders Coalition has really been a real step change, a real catalyst for our thinking. So we set a target some years ago to reduce our direct carbon emissions by 30% by 2025. And as we sit here today, we've already got them down by 28%. So we're easily going to beat that target. And we did that, I guess, in some of those, they seem now like the more traditional ways of putting solar panels on roofs of breweries and cogeneration boilers and things like that. We started to innovate in power purchase agreements. So in one of the big areas for us, which is about 30% of our 60 gigawatt energy consumption in New South Wales, we partnered with Energy and we did a power purchase agreement, not just for our breweries, but also for the Australian Hotel Association, 230 pubs and clubs. Now, and that's 15,000 tonnes of carbon that we abated at that point. But we then went another step and said, okay, we want to be carbon neutral now. So with Climate Active, we invested in the offsets so that we are Australia's largest big carbon neutral brewer. And but we knew more needed to be done. So we recently said, no, we're going to get to a net zero value chain by 2050. And that moves me on to the second point, which is, how do we face into the challenges that presents? I think one of the first things to say is, as we move towards that, we've got to keep doing the things that we have been doing. So we'll do more solar panels, more power purchase agreements. We're running trials now with electric trucks. And every time I visit one of our sites, whether it's an office or a brewery or a distribution center, what I'm asking people to show me is what they're doing in terms of reducing our carbon load. And there's some fantastic ideas, even if it's turning boilers down by 0.5%, 1%, whatever they're doing. And what we've found is the whole organization, every person is engaged in that. And that's a little bit around the personal leadership journey that has been talked about. The second thing, I think, is working on our offset program. We want to get more into some big domestic offset programs, start some new ones, and really invest in that. And we've used the carbon offset program as like an internal carbon price, which is motivating as well for the organization. But the biggest challenge that we see ahead of us is really scope 3. Now, if you look at one of these bottles of beer behind me, 80% of the carbon footprint is outside of our direct control. So if we really want to make an impact and get to the net zero by 2050, we have to start working with all of our partners on how we make that come true. And that is about putting us together with our suppliers. And I've met with all of our key suppliers, and we found some people were really on the journey, some people were kind of on the journey, and some people were not on the journey, and we were helping them to understand what was coming up. And this is really coming on to my third point, where I think the Climate Leaders Coalition has been so important. Like my dad used to say to me, there's a tool for every job. And for me, the Climate Leaders Coalition has been a great tool for this job. And why is that? Because it does put CEOs together who can come from different industries and can discuss what they're doing, and they can discuss also what they've seen in other parts of the world, which we can take inspiration from. And there's been some really great ideas that have come up from that. And if we don't, fix the whole supply chain issue or get it coordinated, we're really going to struggle, because 50% of global greenhouse gases come from eight supply chains, of which food and FMCG, fashion are all part of. So in the Climate Leaders Coalition, we've got a group of CEOs working on Scope 3. We're pulling together a playbook of the kind of things you need to look at, because one of the things we found was, where do you get started in terms of the measurement, in terms of the data communication, in terms of where are the big issues? How do you get your partners engaged in that journey as well? What are the commercial implications of that, not only upstream, but also downstream in the supply chain? So we're pulling together that playbook, and there's been great conversations about that. Steve's in there. Adam, I think, is on the call now, is part of that too. And it's really CEOs talking to CEOs, and I've found that so useful in terms of that understanding. And the other thing is, there's such a willing collaboration between the member organizations that we're putting together 3 pilots of different supply chains, of pulling together upstream, downstream of those supply chains, and piloting some of the ideas that we have, and seeing what works well and what doesn't work so well, and sharing those learnings, so that we, in those groups, and we'd be in an FMCG or consumer packaged goods group, we're learning together with our customers and with our suppliers on how we're going to tackle this. So I've found that a very useful, a super useful tool for that. So I'd like to thank the B team and the other members of the Climate Leaders Coalition for that. But I'll wrap it up there so we can hear from Steve. But it's an incredibly challenging thing to do, and I'm inspired to hear all of the conversations that have been happening in Glasgow. John, back to you.
Thank you, Stuart. And I agree, Scope 3 is an immense challenge, and getting CEOs together is a way we can cut through to some solutions. Now keep those questions coming in on the Q&A tab. I see we've got a couple already. If you've got others, please put them in there. I'd like to introduce now Stephen Worrell. So Stephen leads Microsoft in Australia, New Zealand, and Microsoft's always been one of those companies that we look to for innovation and we look to for leadership. And this area is no exception. So I'd love to hear about your contribution to the roadmap, both in Microsoft, but also how you see the broader coalition reaching those goals.
Very happy to, John, and thank you so much for the invitation. And I'll also just acknowledge your leadership, David, and Lynette's leadership for pulling us together. We really appreciate it very, very much. Stuart, I also want to compliment you on your product placement. That was amazing. I have a suspicion that our audience in Glasgow might be thinking about a coffee, but I can assure everyone it is, 8:30 here on Wednesday evening. It's most certainly beer time here, and it was very difficult to concentrate with all of those wonderful products coming straight at us. But look, as I kick off, I quickly would also like to acknowledge the Camaragal. They are the traditional custodians of this amazing place that I have the privilege to live and work on. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. But look, I'll be brief, John, with that setup, because I think the conversation that we're about to have is probably where we'll all be most interested. But look, very quickly, Microsoft's plan, the plan is very public, so some will be aware of it. The headline is that we will be carbon negative by 2030, and that by 2050, we will have removed all carbon from the atmosphere that we have created since the inception of the firm back in 1975. In addition, our sustainability policy also covers waste, water, and other resources inside our business. And I think the establishment of our plan, which we launched officially last year, has been a rallying cry for many across our organisation. Because one of the reflections that I have as I think about our government's recent announcement of our net zero plan by 2050 is the media's fascination with not having all of the answers in that plan. And the reality is, in the private sector, we don't have all the answers either. We have a very ambitious target, and I've just shared a Microsoft's plan right there. But it's fair to say we don't have all of the answers as to how we're going to deliver on our ambition. And yet we're very comfortable with that, because we know that technology is advancing rapidly. And we know that by working together with our suppliers, and obviously brings us to the topic of the CLC, working with others, we know that we will be able to accelerate our progress. And I think that's something that we have to be comfortable with, because the thought that we can have fully detailed plans at this stage looking out 30 years, I don't know there's anyone that would reasonably claim that they can fully detail a plan for such an extended period. So that's a quick overview of the Microsoft plan. To be fair, any one company's plan is really not that interesting, because what is important is the system level response. And Hala and Sharon and David have talked about this already, but this is a complex challenge that requires a systems level response. And it is through us working together that it's very obvious to us here at Microsoft, and obviously the other members of the CLC, that we'll take a combined effort, and that we will go further together than we will alone. That's already been clear in some of the examples that Stuart's just mentioned, with the Scope 3 discussions that we're having about ways in which we could bring our combined resources to bear to accelerate the progress that any one of us individually might be making. And I think there's also a realization that most of the challenges that we're confronted with in any part of our carbon footprint, the solutions to those challenges will invariably be found at the intersection of science and technology. And none of us have all of the capabilities that are going to be essential in that context. And so we're very proud to be a member of the CLC. We're very passionate here in Australia about the future of our country, and playing whatever role we can to accelerate the efforts of Australian industry. And maybe the last thought, John, I'll share as I round up is, the CLC plays such a vital role, not only in bringing us together to share how each individual organisation is going about its own challenges and how we might accelerate progress, but it's also a fundamental recognition that industry can do more. This is a message that I've, or a share from Larry Marshall, who's the CEO of CSIRO, our National Science Agency, has shared with me many times over the last couple of years. In our country, we've had many political debates about the future of our energy policy, and we've seen governments come and go as a result of that policy debate backwards and forwards. And yet the reality is there's no need for any of us to wait around. That policy certainty in some form or fashion is going to make it then possible for us to make progress, because it's quite obvious we can make progress right now, and that's exactly what the CLC is doing. So John, thank you so much for the opportunity to join. I'll pass back and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you for those comments, Stephen, and for everything you're doing at Microsoft and in the coalition. Now it's time to ask some questions to Stuart, Stephen, and David. So if we could call them up on screen. Please continue to put the questions in the Q&A on screen. I'll also encourage those in the room to think of some questions that we can ask. I'd like to start with one, if I may, and that's inspired by actually someone I admitted to acknowledge earlier, Sharon Burrow, who as a B team leader, but also from the ICTU, inspired us when we launched the coalition by making sure that we knew this was a human opportunity and challenge, and that we mustn't leave people behind. Now, as business has so many employees, so many customers, operates in communities all around the world, I'd love the panel's view on that. So, Stuart, Stephen, or David, how do we achieve these goals and reach net zero, but make sure that we don't leave anybody behind? Any of you like to offer a comment?
Well, John, I'll go, because part of the work that we've been doing at CSIRO in Australia is actually going to some of these communities and actually working with the communities and determining what options there are in the future. So I think that we've got to lean in and actually confront the reality of what the transition will mean and develop alternative plans. But it can't always be done at the macro level. You've got to get at every community. I mean, look at 8.5 million square kilometres. We have so many communities in Australia that are impacted by this transition. So I think it's going to be, there'll be some macro policies, but we've got to get down to the local level. And I think, address the fear. There's only one way to address fear, and that's head on. And what I worry about is that you hear, especially in the coal mines, and all the industries that are built around coal mines, people are fearful for their livelihoods, for their children, and will they have to move into cities? And I think that we've got to have the conversation with them about how we're going to do that transition. But so often, it's had in the papers rather than getting out and seeing it. So a lot of our scientists are looking at the social aspects of that change and trying to work through at the local community, the mayor and the local council. And I think that's what we need to do. Now, will there need to be, broader, national, federal government policy? I'm sure there will, but that's part of what we're doing.
I'll add a thought there, John. Thank you, David. And John, this is very much from a tech industry perspective, as you'll appreciate. But I think it's a big question you've asked, and there are many aspects of it. But I think fair to say over the last 2 years through the pandemic, there's been a realization that life, business, our communities can continue to operate in very different ways to what they might have prior to the pandemic. But we're very resourceful, and we find ways to continue to provide the essential services that are so necessary. I think about health services here in Australia. I think about education. In many cases, much of this has continued on throughout the pandemic, in many cases being delivered in a digital context, increasing the quality of service and availability of services available to people in regional parts of our country who, as an example, may not have felt that they were being equally served prior to the pandemic. And so I think, to your question, as I say, it's a big question, but yes, there is an opportunity now. This is the single largest generational shift in terms of the relationship we all have with what we call work. And I think many people across the world are rethinking that relationship as a result of the pandemic. Is there an opportunity for us to rethink many aspects of our community to ensure we come back in a more equitable fashion? I think for sure. I believe technology and science is going to lead the way.
Thank you, Stephen. Now, do we have any questions either in the room, or I know John O'Brien has been monitoring the Q&A, so we can find one there. In the room first. They're all a bit shy here in Glasgow. Ah, we do have one.
My name's Leah Sullivan. I'm with the B team, and I'm wondering, for Australian CEOs, what are the things that international community can do to most help you and support you on your journey?
So I'll just repeat the question for those on the live stream. This is Leah Sullivan from the B team. And the question is, for Australian CEOs, what are the things that the international community can do most to help? Stuart, we've got and if not, I think Stephen has a point of view on there. Maybe you go first, Stephen, and then Stuart, and then David, if you have any views.
Sure. Again, it's an important question, and there are multiple answers. But I think certainly through our global network, we learn a lot about how to accelerate decarbonisation efforts through the work that our network is engaged in around the world. There's a particular industrial hub that we're working on in the UK right now, where those learnings are being shared directly with myself and my team in context of conversations we're having within the TLC here in Australia. And so one very clear answer is, there's no ownership or proprietorship over great ideas. And we see wonderful activity and we see great progress being made in many countries around the world. And we try to do our best to bring that to bear here. We would love the international community to continue to highlight best practices or areas where we can learn and adopt here.
Good. Stuart?
Well, I think just building on Stephen's point, we've seen many case studies of different industries and supply chains in different parts of the world who've tackled scope 3 in sort of intersecting parts of their supply chains. And those case studies have been really informative about how they handled the commercial relationships, how they handled the data relationships. So that's really useful. And I think in that realization of the global nature of these supply chains, that we have to bring suppliers from all parts of the world, even if you're just talking to a brewer in Australia. Our supply chains are reaching across the world, and having those conversations with international supply partners about where they are and what their journey is, and making sure that those different countries, those different suppliers, and in those different regimes, political regimes, are on the same path. And so that when we have those conversations about how we get those supply chains to communicate properly about the data, the measurement, the international community can really help to make sure that conversation is happening everywhere, not just in one market.
Yeah, John, it's an interesting one. I mean, obviously the sharing of best practice and technology innovation. I think the one that we've had a go at that has been hard is trying to get greater partnership at the local level. And I know, John, you were part of that, trying to look, say, in the Pilbara, could we share infrastructure? Could we do something between organisations? And or even at a city level or community level. They're very complex things to do because you get involved in commercial considerations and timing. But I do think there needs to be some of these big projects that really are going to take a big chunk out of our emissions at a country level. And so if we can get some leadership, because a lot of the companies in Glasgow will be, truly global multinational companies. The more that we can get them engaged in actually real practical solutions would be wonderful. But we're all aware of how difficult that is. But I do think we're going to need to do it as we move forward. Yeah, that would be my thought.
Thank you. And yes, certainly, I think those of us in Glasgow feel an obligation to find those best ideas and make the connections. And not to mention, there are some ideas from Australia that are gathering some interest, I must say, amongst the other countries here as well. We have one more question in the room, and then we're going to turn to some from the chat. So please, Sharon.
So Anna Freeman, Policy Director at the Clean Energy Council. I'm interested in how this group might be encouraging stronger ambition over the next decade, noting that really this is the decade in which we can try and maintain temperature increases to no more than 1.5 or stabilise them at that level. There seems to be a lack of interest in doing that over the next 10 years from a political level. What does this group intend to do in terms of elevating that discussion within the Australian community?
So thank you, Anna. Question from Anna Freeman about this critical decade that we're now in, and perhaps there's not as much commitment to 2030 in general, but what about in business, and what can this group do to make sure that we are all acting and raising the awareness of the need to act in this decade?
Okay, John. Well, let me lean into this one. So we had some really interesting conversations when we discussed with Lynette how to structure this group, and we said, do we need every member to commit to a reduction target by 2030 or 2050? Should we make it only those who were really going to be brave and step forward? We concluded that inclusion was more important than sort of only the elite athletes coming together in this area. So we have not, dictated or mandated in any way that a particular company should do something by 2030. However, we would encourage, we would hope to share about those that have greater ambition, and we think it's very important as a leadership group. But we are very much about helping people on the journey, not dictating or trying to make them do something. There are big challenges. Every company is different. I mean, we applaud Microsoft going to net positive by 2030. And there's some of the people in our groups who have gone to net zero by 2025, but we have not mandated it, has been the way we've approached it now. Yeah, that's been our approach. Right, John?
Yeah, I think that's right. But hopefully that if the community sees how much business is acting and reading the 2030 roadmap, you will certainly see that, then that may provide impetus for others to also move and make it a bit safer, to be honest, for others to move. Yeah. Now we've time for, I think, a question from the chat, and then I'm going to hand over to Andrew Liveris to wrap up.
So there's quite a few there, and I've tried to combine a couple, and you might be able to hear directly from combining Dave McCarthy and Beth Worrell, a little bit linked to David's last point, but is the CLC compromised by having heavy emitters as part of it? Should we just all be, just the people who are not emitting so much and exporting fossil fuels? But then that goes on to, really the regional transition challenge. How do we really tackle that? And how do we upskill the workforce and transition workforces? And what are the thoughts on that?
So what do we think? Are we penalised by having the high emitters? Who was it that was accused of robbing banks and said, why do you rob banks? And they said, well, because that's where the money is. So there is something like have heavy emitters. Well, that's where the emissions are. So that's where the action needs to happen. I don't know, Stephen Stewart, are you worried about associating with the heavy emitters?
Not at all. I think the reality is if we're going to address this at a systems level, I mentioned this earlier, then we have to acknowledge there are many different players within that system. In some cases, players that have helped to build our economy to the point that we are today. And so I think far from excluding people, as David said, we want to make this an inclusive effort, because it's only by working together we're going to progress. And I don't think, to the earlier question, that we need to wait for, or that somehow the political conversation should continue to play an overweight role in our considerations, because there is so much that can be done. It's already obvious in the CLC conversations that if we were to work more closely together, there's opportunity for us to progress. So that's first thought. Second quick thought then on the regional skilling idea. It's for me, I see signals from government and from our ecosystem all the time in terms of the realization that we do need as a nation to think about diversifying the sources of talent that we seek to bring into our industry. And this is certainly true for the tech industry. And coincidentally, just today, there was an announcement by the New South Wales government here around a regional skills program. And so I think there's a momentum that we are building, where enough people become involved in the CLC and we demonstrate the impact that we can have. We continue to engage with government, we engage with stakeholders. I think this becomes the change that we are looking to effect. And as a system, then we start to achieve the bigger goals that we need to achieve as a nation.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I think that it is crucial to get the whole system working together, and skills are a huge part of that. Now, I know we only are in the last 5 minutes of our hour, so I'm going to ask Andrew Liveris, who has always been a very thoughtful person about the energy transition and the importance of Australia's leadership, to wrap up for us. So, thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John, and hello everyone in the room, and of course hello to my fellow citizens of Australia. And I really do appreciate the opportunity to be here in the context of the B team under Hala's leadership. I've been a member for half a dozen years, and I must say at Dow we were very forward-leaning into making sustainability a key part of our business strategy and our DNA. I'll make 3 key points and wrap up. They've been actually talked about, and I thought very, very well done. And John and David and Lynette, I love Lynette. She's a force of nature, and so she found me in Australia when I was there through COVID, and conscripted me to help Sharon and others to do what you have done. And the CLC, the acronym we're now using, Climate Leaders Coalition, is up and running and launched, and it's so fitting it's here in Glasgow. And I've got to tell you, it's a very proud moment. It's one of my early events here in Glasgow to actually help you make this very emphatic statement. So the 3 key points, for those like me who have only been here 24 hours, COP26 lead up to now to beyond is a tipping point moment. We can use any discontinuity we want, any intervention we want. In the business community, that means it's opportunity rich, and we're moving from storming to forming to norming, so that we go into the topic that is actually the CLC's main job, which is actually, instead of defiance and denial, instead of discussion and dialogue, we get to doing. The doing word, a call to action, is only done by leveraging best practices and getting the smartest ideas, and then basically tailoring them to our company, to our enterprise, and figuring a way to get this done, not just to be talking about. That's the sense of Glasgow. That's the moment Glasgow will be remembered for. I see it, feel it already. And I will tell you, many COPs later, like we're referring to Paris as a tipping point, we'll refer to Glasgow as a tipping point, because we're moving to action. Second point I'll make has been asked about, and I have lived this my entire career. Work and activity in the 21st century, by definition, Steve Worrell will basically nod his head when I say this, with the digital age arriving, the collision, or better said, intersection between business, government, and civil society has arrived on us. And it's at those intersections and friction points that action has to occur. It's complex. Actually, society is quite afraid because leadership has been lacking. And here's the step-up opportunity the CLC's leaned into. Business can lead this. Why? Because business not only has an accountability and responsibility beyond its financial owners, but to multi-stakeholders. In fact, businesses' license to operate is from civil society through governments. The better regulations that come from activities such as the ones we're asking for here, and all the various articles agreed to in Paris that have to be committed to, can be business-led. I applaud B Team Australia for leaning into that, creating the CLC. The multi-sectoral representation is powerful, and as I think was said by David Lyon, which is this whole discussion around a toolbox. An energy transition is a toolbox for humans to use to effect a transition. And that toolbox is being laid out with the roadmap that's been launched by the CLC. The last thing I'll say, as a passionate Australian, never lost sight of where I came from and how I got there, and the fantastic opportunities that the country offers its citizens. It's time we move from this notion of being a farm, a hotel, and a quarry, which are all great, but it's a smart nation that can innovate, and I've seen it, and David, as chair of the CSIRO, is a great example. Larry Marshall was referenced. We have the technology, the brains, and the smarts to help lead the world to the solution set here, and I love the idea that we're leaning into that as well. Opportunity rich. There's nothing to be afraid of here. It's such a sensational time to be alive and to grab the mantle. So thank you. Great panel today, and great launch, John. Thank you for giving me a few minutes.
Thank you, Andrew. A very energizing call to action, as only you can. And I think that reminder that we have certainly natural advantages in sustainable energy sources, but we also have the smarts, the skills, the talent, the innovation. And we hope with the Climate Leaders Coalition, we can share a lot of those ideas and progress even faster towards net zero, but particularly on the roadmap to 2030 in this crucial decade. Thank you to our panelists, David, Stuart, and Stephen. Thank you to everybody in the room, to Sharon and Deloitte for hosting, and to the Global B team, and in particular, the inspiration for the Climate Leaders Coalition, Lynette Main, who's there in Sydney. But thank you, Lynette, for everything that you do to energize us all on this very important roadmap to 2030. Thanks everyone for watching, and enjoy the rest of your evening in Australia, and hopefully a productive, optimistic day for those of us in Glasgow. Thank you.